Hi everyone, it's Katrina. The sunken spaceship. The Baltic Sea anomaly has baffled scientists ever since it was discovered. Nobody knows what it even is, with theories ranging from an alien spaceship to an underwater Nazi bunker, the lost city of Atlantis, or just a piece of rock. Marine explorers identified the structure on the bottom of the sea between Sweden and Finland about a decade ago. Sonar images revealed a mysterious shape in the Baltic Sea, a shape that looks an awful lot like the Millennium Falcon from Star Wars. At least that's one interpretation of it. Some say it looks like a starship that crashed, leaving behind a 1,000-foot skid mark. Others think it looks a little more like an underwater base, perhaps the remains of something constructed by a lost civilization or a secret government agency. The anomaly allegedly gives off a strange electrical interference, which has led to speculation that it's a forgotten alien device. Other wild speculation says it could be the remnants of a military project from World War II dumped in the ocean. But Associate Professor Volker Bruchert from Stockholm University says the object is nothing but a glacial deposit, one that formed during the Ice Age. Which theory do you prefer? Let me know in the comments below. The hot tub of despair. In the Gulf of Mexico, 3,300 feet beneath the surface, is a geological marvel called the hot tub of despair. It's an underwater lake, a sunken crater of extremely salty water and methane that kills every creature foolish enough to swim into it. Scientists discovered the horrible underwater lake using the remotely operated vehicle, the Hercules. Researchers were surprised to discover an absurd number of crab corpses that had accidentally scuttled into the pool and succumbed to the elements. Scott Wankel, a marine chemist, speculated some animals traveled to the hot tub of despair just to die. The underwater lake is something known as a brine pool. The brine is so thick you can physically land a submarine on top of it, like driving a car onto a lake of salt. Even though it's at the bottom of the ocean, way down in the deep sea, it's still a pool because the liquid is of a different consistency. It formed over millions of years as salt evaporated and seeped into huge pits. As the salt becomes heavier and heavier, it slowly breaks through the shale beneath and allows oil and gas to escape, turning the brine pools into toxic death traps. The reason the pool is so toxic to most sea creatures is that the fluid contains little oxygen and poisonous chemicals. It's a cesspool of hydrogen sulfide and methane, which kills fish and other organisms almost instantaneously when they come into contact with it. Lion City. Underneath the surface of Qiandao Lake in China lies a mysterious lost city dating back centuries. It's called Xicheng, or Lion City. It was flooded during the industrialization of China during the 1950s. A hydroelectric dam was built for the province, which required the ancient city to be completely submerged. The lake itself, called Thousand Island Lake, is a massive body of fresh water. There are over 1,000 islands in the lake, which is where it gets its name. Lion City was home to about 300,000 people when it became lost at the bottom of the lake. Its sinking erased centuries of ancestral history. Most historians agree Lion City was built in 621 AD by the Tang dynasty, making it over 1,400 years old. It had 265 arches, many temples, thousands of homes, and paved roads. It was a truly ancient city from Imperial China, and it's in almost the exact same shape as it was 70 years ago. Thanks to the cold water, the whole place is preserved like a watery museum. Stonework from the Middle Ages and city walls from the 16th century still stand strong as if they were just built. The most surprising thing is that after the city was submerged, people forgot about it. Hundreds of years of history just slipped everybody's mind, and it wasn't rediscovered until 2001. Pictures didn't begin circulating until 2011, which was when the general public took an interest. Lion City is now a popular scuba diving site for tourists looking to get a look at some underwater history. Would you like to visit? Let me know in the comments. The Oasis of ravenous sharks. 500 meters beneath the surface of the Indian Ocean, deep-sea divers discovered an unknown ecosystem. The ecosystem is a dangerous place, filled with hungry sharks looking for food. scientists named the region the Trapping Zone and compared it to a very large ocean desert. It's located not far from the Maldives, pretty close to the infamous Mariana Trench. Researchers who embarked on an underwater mission were shocked to see huge schools of fish and sharks like dense, swarming clouds. The thing about this place is that it's blocked by steep cliffs and fossilized reefs. Tiny creatures known as micronecton swim down into the zone and then have a difficult time finding their way out. This attracted the sharks, who now seem to live here permanently. It's a distinctive and unique ecosystem, a stable circle of prey and predator. The ravenous sharks constantly hunt the micronecton, who run and hide and breed. But because of these slopes, both prey and predator are stuck together in this underwater oasis. But of course, there are a lot of other creatures here as well. There are deep water, spiky Oreo fish, schools of tuna, six-gill sharks, tiger sharks, gulper sharks, silky sharks, and even scalloped hammerhead sharks. It's shoutout time! Big thank you to Nicole Black and Chris Wilbur Dyson for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already to keep up with all of the latest discoveries. 17th century warship. The wreckage of a 17th century warship called the Applet was recently discovered by archaeologists in Sweden. It was a monumental discovery because the warship has direct ties to the Vasa, its sister ship that capsized in 1625 on its maiden voyage. The Vasa is currently on display in a Stockholm museum, but the wreckage of the Applet eluded researchers for years. Now it's finally been found, and it's nothing short of amazing. The Applet served in the 30 Years' War and was deliberately sunk off the coast of Stockholm in 1659, when it was deemed unseaworthy. The 30 Years' War was one of the most devastating conflicts in European history, which lasted between 1618 and 1648. It was one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history, resulting in over 8 million casualties, not only from military battles, but from famine and disease. It all started because of the Catholic and Protestant states which formed the wildly unstable Holy Roman Empire. But as the war evolved, it became less about religion and more about who was going to rule Europe with an iron fist for the next few centuries. Getting back to the boat, it was discovered by local archaeologists working with the Swedish Navy. Everyone was shocked because they had given up hope that any additional wrecks would be found in the area. The seabed near Sweden was covered in rocks in the 1800s, then completely dredged in the early 1900s. There shouldn't have been anything left to find. Yet they uncovered a full warship. But because the shipwreck is in a protected military area, there is no way to salvage it. Divers aren't even allowed to go down there unless accompanied by the Swedish Navy. The Great Dog Island airplane wreck. Off the shore of Great Dog Island in the British Virgin Islands, there is an airplane sitting at the bottom of the ocean. There isn't much left of the aircraft today, but it is a popular dive site with a bizarre history. It all began in 1993. The airplane was scheduled to leave from Tortola carrying 27 passengers, but it never did. The aircraft ran off the runway and went straight into the sea and sank. It hit the water about 200 feet from the end of the runway, though luckily everyone on board survived. The airplane was later pulled out of its murky graveyard and stuffed into a hangar, but it was utterly destroyed. It briefly found itself used as a movie prop before being thrown in the water at Great Dog Island to become an artificial reef. It's still out there today under 40 feet of water, looking more like a coral garden than a destroyed airplane. That's good, at least it was sacrificed for a higher purpose. If you can't be an airplane, why not be a coral reef? Treasure from the Titanic. All kinds of strange and fascinating treasures have been rescued from the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, specifically from the wreckage of the Titanic. Each and every piece salvaged by divers is worth a small fortune. A doll head was rescued from the Titanic in 1977 and sold for $7,900. Divers first thought the porcelain figure was a rock, then realized it was the head of a doll. The sailor who found it, dredged up from a depth of about 2,000 meters, kept it until he died in 1992. The head then found its way to a museum in Spain before being sold at auction in 2018. But there's a lot more where that came from. A biscuit from one of the lifeboats was sold to a collector in Greece for about $23,000 in 2015. One of the life jackets from the Titanic was discovered by a farmer on the shoreline of Nova Scotia in 1912. It was unused, so it didn't come from one of the survivors. It must have made its way from the wreckage, then floated across the Atlantic Ocean until it wound up on shore in Canada. It's one of only 6 Titanic life jackets found, and it sold for $68,000. When the Titanic started to sink, everyone panicked. In the pandemonium that swept over everyone on board, they started throwing things off the ship in hopes that it would stop it from sinking. One of the objects thrown overboard was a deck chair, which was pulled out of the ocean and then sold in 2015 for $154,000. Medieval shipwreck. Researchers from Bournemouth University in the UK have discovered what could be the earliest medieval shipwreck in English waters. The vessel, called a clinker ship, was made from overlapping planks of wood and carried a cargo of raw stone when it sank in the 13th century. In the early medieval days, Purbeck marble slabs were used across much of England. These slabs were also exported to Ireland and mainland Europe for construction. We know this is a transport ship because the wreckage was found littered with huge stones that had been quarried and then sent for sale. An analysis of the wood used to build the ship's hull revealed the trees were cut down around 1242 AD in Ireland. This is a great example of medieval globalization. The wood was cut down in Ireland, shipped to England, then used in the construction of a boat. That boat was set to bring English stones back to Ireland, completing the circle. Tom Cousins, a member of the research team, says very few ships of this age are ever found. These ships sank for unknown reasons 750 years ago, then was discovered by a local charter boat skipper following a violent storm. It's now the earliest English protected wreck site with its hull still intact. Mystery creatures. Some very strange creatures have just been found at the bottom of the Indian Ocean. Things like eels with no eyes, fish that look like bats, and underwater lizards with rows of deadly teeth. The discoveries were made by scientists with Australia's Museum's Victoria Research Institute. They were investigating a string of underwater volcanoes 2,500 miles from Australia when they started seeing all these weird critters. Scientist Tim O'Hara says each species is adapted to exist in the extreme deep-sea environment. One of the never-before-seen specimens was a blind eel with extremely gelatinous skin like pale jelly. The eel lives at an extreme depth where almost no light can reach. For this reason, it has developed extremely poor eyesight. It's basically blind, and uses its other sensors to navigate its watery home. The team also found a creepy monster called the high-fin lizardfish. It has a disgusting red mouth as if it's bleeding from its gums and translucent white skin. Other freaky critters include the flatfish, a fish that, as its name suggests, is totally flat and has 2 eyeballs on one side of its head instead of on either side. They also came across a viperfish with translucent fangs. And then there are the other animals that appear to be entirely new species, each one uglier and more frightening than the last. Roman anchor. Off the coast of England, maritime archaeologists found a rare Roman anchor sitting at the bottom of the ocean. They believe it belonged to a Roman Navy ship that was involved in the invasion of Britain 2,000 years ago. The enormous anchor weighs a whopping 220 pounds and was made from solid iron. It's nearly 7 feet long and was found when researchers were doing survey work at the potential site for a new offshore wind farm. This discovery is a big deal. According to Brandon Mason from Maritime Archaeology Limited, only 3 pre-Viking anchors have ever been found in northern European waters. That means anchors prior to 750 AD. This is part of a rare collection. It was likely used by a trading vessel of the Classis Britannica. The Classis Britannica was the very first British Navy formed in the 1st century AD. The ships that the Romans used to conquer Britain were then used by later generations to defend it. The whole company consisted of around 7,000 crew members and 900 ships. That was the kind of power needed for the Romans to take Britain for themselves in 43 AD. The Roman navy delivered thousands of soldiers from mainland Europe to the peaceful fields of Britain and conquered the lands. This anchor is a physical reminder of Britain's Roman past.
New islands. The Red Sea has parted to create 2 new islands. Located between Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, 2 brand new islands were recently born. While the birth of volcanic islands is a pretty rare event, we got to see it happen in real time, thanks to satellite images. The images were brought to us by researchers at the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology in Saudi Arabia. These 2 new islands formed when 2 tectonic plates pulled apart, providing scientists with new insights into a rift in the Earth's crust. It's a pretty slow process, with the tectonic plates only separating about 6 millimeters annually. It was finally enough that magma burst up through the cracks, creating eruptions that lasted for weeks at a time. Even with just a handful of millimeters between the 2 plates, it was enough to unleash so much magma that it hit the surface and cooled to form volcanic rock, creating the pair of islands. The islands belong to Yemen and are called Sholan and Jadid. Earthquake activity has affected the region for years, and all that shaking for over 10 years just created too much pressure, and more islands will probably pop up in the future. The Thistlegorm. The SS Thistlegorm was constructed back in 1940 in the dockyards of Sunderland, England. It was originally designed as an armed freighter, with a massive anti-aircraft gun and a machine gun fitted to its stern. After it was launched, the Thistlegorm sailed to the United States. It collected some steel rails and parts for aircraft, stopped briefly in Argentina, then loaded up with rum in the West Indies. But that would be her only useful voyage, because just 1 year after she was made, she sank. The SS Thistlegorm left Glasgow on June 2, 1941. She was bound for Alexandria in Egypt, stocked full of trucks and motorcycles. Remember that 1941 was during World War II. When the ship docked at safe anchorage on the Red Sea, she got bombarded by the German Luftwaffe. 4 sailors and 5 Royal Navy crew were killed during the attack, and the ship, along with its cargo, was lost to the sea. The ship was officially rediscovered 9 years later by Jacques Cousteau, and these days it is one of the best diving sites in the world. The ship is now home to a bunch of ruined vehicles from the 40s, as well as tons of moray eels, crocodile fish, and barracuda. Nearby is the gigantic propeller, the 2 anti-aircraft guns, tanks and munitions, all spread out in the rubble. Dolphins and coral mucus. Scientists have made a rather unusual discovery involving dolphins in the Red Sea. It was a few years ago when scientists first noticed that dolphins had a habit of scraping their skin against the corals just off the coast of Egypt. This behavior was also noticed by divers. And so, researchers from the University of Zurich investigated what these dolphins were doing. The dolphins use the Red Sea corals as a kind of medication. To understand, we have to look at the exact type of coral the dolphins rub themselves against. It's called Gorgonian coral, and it secretes mucus that contains antimicrobial properties. The dolphins have also been spotted rubbing their bodies against leather corals and sponges, both of which are living organisms that produce bioactive substances. So finally, scientists have figured out why these substances are so good for dolphin skin. They believe the compounds produced help to keep dolphin skin healthy. The dolphins are using the coral mucus as a kind of skincare product. Scientists say it prevents skin infections, keeps their skin nice and shiny, and helps their body stay healthy. Hot holes. Dr. David A. Ross with the Oceanographic Institution has discovered another fiery hole in the Red Sea. A fiery hole has been defined by Dr. Ross as a deep pocket in the sea which is filled with hot and extremely salty water, also called hot brine. It extends down to the cooler sea bottom, but it's much hotter at the top. What's surprising is that there are now 3 mysterious hot holes that have been identified in the Red Sea. The first of these hot and salty patches were discovered in the 1880s by a Russian ship. Another was discovered in 1964 by a British research vessel. The water temperature in these hot pockets can reach upwards of 133 degrees Fahrenheit. This is like swimming in a hot tub. And one hole is located right off the coast of the sacred city of Mecca. What this means is that if the Israelites really had been fleeing in the days of Exodus, and Moses really had parted the sea, there's a pretty good chance the Egyptian soldiers chasing them across the seabed would have been boiled like lobsters. But what's causing the hot holes really? It seems to be hydrothermal vents, like the chimneys of volcanoes. While we don't know for sure, some scientists have speculated the sea floor is slowly drifting apart. The whole sea floor might collapse into the mouth of one giant underwater volcano, the Squid and the Shipwreck. In 2020, a team of scientists descended into the darkness of the Red Sea and discovered a lost shipwreck. They couldn't believe their eyes when they began investigating the mysterious wreckage, looking like some forgotten pirate ship stranded on the bottom of a black lagoon. Then, a sea monster appeared. It wasn't enough that they had just discovered a lost ship. They also found an enormous beast that appeared to have made the ruined vessel its home. The creature was some kind of miniature kraken, a giant squid that had taken over the wreckage and made its nest inside. Thankfully, the team who made the discovery wasn't actually down in the dark abyss wearing scuba suits, or else they may never have returned to the surface. They were instead sitting safely on their boat, the research vessel Ocean Explorer, and looking at the shipwreck through the camera lens of a remotely controlled vehicle. This all happened at a depth of about 2,800 feet, in one of the deepest parts of the Red Sea. So what was the creature? Zoologist Dr. Michael Vecchione says it was probably a purple back-flying squid. But not just any purple back-flying squid, one in giant form. This one was positively massive, likely between 7 and 10 feet long. And while that may not sound that big, just imagine a squid 4 or 5 feet taller than you as it wraps its tentacles around your face. The shipwreck was called the Pella. The ship originally caught fire and sank off the coast of Jordan in 2011. It had 1,229 passengers on board, though luckily they were all rescued before the ship burned to a crisp and sank beneath the surface. The Lost Egyptian Fleet. At an Egyptian temple in Deir el-Bahri, there is a scene carved into the wall from about 1480 BC. The scene is of a giant merchant ship on some kind of unknown trading expedition. It's a gigantic vessel manned by a large crew of rowers. There are other carvings of other ships representing an entire fleet. Historians believe the picture is supposed to show the legendary journey of the Egyptians traveling to the mysterious land of Punt. It was here that the Egyptians bought all kinds of exotic goods, from treasures to unknown animals. For most of history, this picture was just that, a picture, one showing something that may or may not have happened. However, a recent discovery on a desolate stretch of the Red Sea coast has just proved that this journey was probably very real. Archaeologists from 3 different countries were excavating a dried lagoon when they found evidence of an ancient harbor. They believe it was from this harbor that Queen Hatshepsut ordered the Great Voyage to the land of Punt, a mysterious land that some historians don't even believe is real. There isn't much left of this ancient harbor today. Archaeologists found a reed mat that dates back 3,800 years, old wooden planks, a man-made cave that was probably once used for shipbuilding, and old coils of rope woven from ancient papyrus. This was likely some kind of shipyard and harbor where ancient voyages began. These remarkable discoveries on the coast of the Red Sea might not tell us the exact location of the land of Punt, but it does prove that the Egyptians were extremely skilled when it came to building ships. Tsunami waiting to happen. More than anything, the Red Sea is hiding powerful geological forces beneath its crystal blue waters. 3,000 feet deep in the Tiran Strait, researcher Sam Purkis discovered a gaping chasm outside the window of his submarine. A broken chunk of the seafloor was left behind by an undersea landslide. Sam, a geoscientist at the University of Miami, believes the undersea landslide probably happened about 500 years ago, and it triggered a tsunami that hit the Egyptian coastline with waves over 30 feet tall. There is still a giant chunk of land teetering on the edge of the abyss, and if this chunk of land slips, scientific models suggest it could create a second landslide, which would create an even bigger tsunami, one about twice the size of the one 500 years ago. Just the slightest shake, just one minor earthquake, could cause this entire underwater shelf to fall, And if that happens, it would be catastrophic. We're talking about 60-foot waves washing over Egypt, destroying everything near the coast. Some waves could reach upwards of 100 feet, and they could make it to the coast in less than 3 minutes. What makes this so terrifying is that researchers say it could happen any moment, with just the slightest rumble of the earth. The Lost Chariots. When Moses parted the Red Sea, the Israelites fled, and the Egyptian army followed. But before the Egyptian army could get to the other side, the sea closed, and they were all swallowed under the water. This biblical adventure has never been proven as a genuine historical event. There are some researchers who say the evidence is stuck in the mud at the bottom of the Red Sea. These researchers are underwater archaeologists who were searching for ancient ships and artifacts off the coast of Egypt. According to what they told the Egyptian Antiquities Ministry, they discovered artifacts in the Gulf of Suez. Artifacts they say were proof an army was indeed swallowed by the sea. None of this has been confirmed, and it is hard to find any reliable source. But here's what the archaeologists said. They discovered 400 skeletons, hundreds of pieces of metal armor, and at least 2 war chariots. However, the team says there could be over 5,000 more skeletons and hundreds of more chariots buried beneath the sediment. One artifact uncovered from the sea was an ancient Egyptian sword called a khopesh blade, allegedly found near one of the submerged chariots. Biblical scholars are now saying this is indisputable evidence that Moses' tale in the Bible really happened. However, none of the actual chariots or skeletons have been recovered or documented by any mainstream professionals. The Tentacle Monster. Lucas Ostertag, a German national, was diving in the Red Sea when he encountered a mysterious sea monster with no eyes, no ears, and no mouth. He described the bizarre animal as a long, square rubber pipe-like thing. Lucas wasn't the only one who saw the strange creature, since he was with an underwater group of divers. They all witnessed the freaky beast while diving in the Sataya Reef. Nobody in the group knew what it was, not even the local guides. Lucas said it instantly reminded him of the deep-sea species of monsters from the sci-fi novel The Swarm, creatures whose only purpose is to destroy all of mankind. In reality, the bizarre creature wasn't even a creature at all. The thing that divers saw was simply the leftover arms from a dead jellyfish. A turtle had probably gotten a hold of the jellyfish, bit the juicy part off, and then let the bottom chunk with the legs attached drift off into the sea. These divers didn't see a new species of animal, just a turtle's unfinished meal. What do you think? Ancient trading ship. Divers from Saudi Arabia's Heritage Authority recently found the remains of an old shipwreck from the 18th century. They discovered it in the northern part of the Red Sea, filled with hundreds of awesome artifacts. While nobody knows the name of this ship, archaeologists believe it probably crashed into the coral reef, spilling its cargo and ripping its hull apart. Researchers found scraps of pottery, jars that had once been filled with spices, and scraps of the shipwreck itself. It was probably a merchant vessel traveling across the Red Sea sometime between 1725 and 1750. If that's not exciting enough for you, a team of Saudi and German archaeologists also recently found a Roman shipwreck from a much earlier time. It crashed and sank about 2,000 years ago, and is currently the oldest archaeological shipwreck that's ever been found along the coast of Saudi Arabia. That's saying something, considering there are hundreds of busted vessels down here, leftover trading ships from the days when the Romans controlled the region. Trade was a major source of income, and he who controlled the Red Sea trading routes controlled the flow of cash and goods from the Middle East into Egypt and beyond.
Izu Islands. Miyakejima is one of Japan's Izu Islands and one of the most toxic places in the world. It's not toxic because of the people who live there, but rather because of the volatile volcano that won't stop erupting. The people who live on Miyakejima are under constant threat of being boiled alive by lava. Either that or suffocated to death by sulfuric gas. The island is part of a volcanic chain that has erupted 6 times in the last 100 years. That's a little more than once every 2 decades. And because the whole area is so active volcanically, sulfur gas continuously seeps through the ground like a deadly fog.
The last mass evacuation was in the year 2000. Mount Oyama erupted multiple times in a row, causing dangerously high levels of toxic gas to flood the island like a solid mist. Everyone had to leave, and all flights were banned for 8 years. That's how long it took for the toxic gas to diminish enough that the residents could return to their homes. Would you dare to go back after this? Let me know in the comments below. The Hermit on Socotra Island. Socotra Island is one of the strangest and most magical places in the world. It's off the northwestern tip of Yemen and occupied by very few people. One of them is a mysterious hermit. He lives alone in an isolated cave, fishing with his hands and living a life of utter solitude. His name is Eli, and it's just kind of an accepted thing that he lives there by himself. The island is situated between Somalia and Yemen, right at the precipice where the Arabian Sea bleeds into the Indian Ocean. It is so isolated that scientists estimate 90% of its life forms don't live anywhere else on the planet. It has a surreal landscape with dragon's blood trees and thousands of bright blue crabs that scuttle in the moonlight. Socotra Island truly seems like a completely different planet. Or at least, it has the landscape of a different planet. The hermit known as Eli lives near Detwa Lagoon in a dark cave. But he isn't the only person here. He was once married to one of the other residents of the island. He and his wife had 12 children, but only 6 of them survived due to the harsh conditions on the island. The first medical facility didn't open until 2012, and it's still not exactly the most equipped hospital in the world. Sable Island. Sable Island is one of the most mysterious pieces of land in Canada. It's about 200 miles off the coast of Nova Scotia, with its treacherous waters responsible for an estimated 350 shipwrecks. The bottom of the ocean surrounding the island is reportedly littered with gold and silver, the skeletal remains of sailors, and broken pieces of ships. Sable Island is an inhospitable place where no human has dared to live. The only things that live on the island are the wild horses. It's one of few places left on the planet where horses still roam free. Strangely enough, there's not a single tree on the island. It's less than 1 mile wide in the middle and only about 25 miles long. But it does have enough grass to feed the local horses. Since 2013, Parks Canada has been managing the island very carefully. It's a national park reserve, and visitors are only allowed during the summer, and only with special permission. You can only stay in a designated campsite, and you can't leave or take anything with you, not so much as a grain of sand. As for the mysteries of the island, there is no shortage. It was first recorded on maps in 1502, but nobody knows who discovered it. Some say the Vikings, others say it was the Basques of Spain. There was a brief colony in the 1550s, but the conditions were so unbearable that the settlers gave up. It's also been a sailor's nightmare. Hundreds of ships have been wrecked just trying to sail near the island. That's because there is a continental shelf hiding beneath the water that's about the size of the Grand Canyon, creating vortexes and shifting sandbars that wreck all the vessels. It's shout-out time! I want to say a big thank you to Mitch Campbell and Richard Junkermeyer for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos about amazing discoveries and mysterious places. Utos Islands. The Utos Islands can be found floating on the surface of Lake Titicaca on the Peruvian side. The Utos people believe themselves to be descendants of the first inhabitants of the area, long before the Inca ever came to dominate the region. As a form of protection, the Utos built mobile islands from the totora plant. This special plant allows their islands to float. If they feel like they're in danger, they can push their floating homes away from shore and vanish into the misty interior of the lake. Sadly for the Utos, this method didn't really work. The Inca and the Spanish still found them and almost destroyed them. What's really amazing about the floating islands here is that they've been around for over 1,000 years, maybe even a lot longer. The Utos survived by fishing, gathering bird eggs, and hiding in their floating houses. But it's not just their houses that float, it's the entire village. Over 2,000 people once lived on the floating platforms, and today there are still 1,200 people living there now. They used to live closer to the middle of the lake, but had to relocate nearer to the shore after a brutal storm in 1986 almost destroyed their floating villages. They are currently split up between 4 major settlements on the lake: Newfoundland and the Irish monks. After the Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, Christianity was kept alive by some really unexpected groups. One of them was at the edge of the world in Western Ireland. Monks who had devoted themselves to Christianity in the first centuries after the death of Jesus Christ kept the tradition going. These medieval monks moved into cave monasteries along the Irish coast. They also ventured out into the waters and built honeycomb dwellings to live on isolated islands. Some of them even sailed to North America. Saint Brendan is believed to have discovered North America long before anyone else from Europe. However, it's never been authenticated. We know Saint Brendan was born in Ireland around the year 489. He founded the monastery at Clonfert in Galway, but when Saint Brendan reached his 70s, he decided to go on a spiritual voyage. He and 17 other monks got into rough wooden boats and set sail across the North Atlantic. They were gone for 7 years. During their voyage, the monks supposedly discovered a mysterious island, which they believed was the land of promise for the Christian people. They discovered precious stones and mysterious fruits and returned to Europe with them as proof. Many scholars believe Saint Brendan and his monks discovered the island of Newfoundland. This is the same island that was discovered by Vikings about 500 years later. If true, it would mean that Saint Brendan, an Irish monk, found North America 1,000 years before Christopher Columbus. It's actually very possible. In 1976, adventurer Tim Severin set out to prove the myth of Saint Brendan and his mystery island. He built a replica of the boat that would have been used by the Irish monks and sailed it across the Atlantic to Newfoundland. This proved once and for all that Irish monks really could have found North America 1,500 years before today. The Isle of Demons. There is an island off the coast of Newfoundland, that same island visited by Saint Brendan and his monks 1,500 years ago. The island is called the Isle of Demons, and chatter began to spread in the 16th century that anyone who ventured near the island heard the voices of evil spirits. In 1424, the island appeared for the first time on a map created by the Venetian cartographer Giovanni Pizzigano. It appeared again on another map in 1508, and once more in 1556, thanks to a map published by Giacomo Gastaldi. But it wasn't until the later part of the 16th century the rumors began circulating about the island. There was news in 1542 that a woman named Marguerite de la Roque embarked upon a voyage with her uncle. During the voyage, she fell in love with a sailor and the two became romantic. The uncle disapproved of the relationship, and so he abandoned Marguerite and the sailor on the Isle of Demons. The sailor died, and so too did the child Marguerite was carrying. But after spending 2 years on the island, she escaped thanks to a passing fisherman. After that, people began to associate the island with demons and evil spirits. Nobody would go near it anymore because it was said that if a vessel drifted too close, they could be confused by the voices of the spirits and shipwrecked. Hog Island. In 1956, Hog Island was being torn apart. The small island in the Chesapeake Bay was being bludgeoned by waves from the Atlantic Ocean. It was in the midst of disintegrating, something that happens to islands as the water levels change and the topography of our planet morphs. But this was a weird situation because the island had bodies buried on it. Human corpses were being thrust out of their graves by the waves as the island broke apart. One of these bodies belonged to George Avery Melvin, who died in 1934. This wouldn't have been big news if not for the fact that George's body was perfectly preserved. He'd been dead for 22 years, but hadn't decayed at all. To this day, we still don't know what happened to George. Bob Smith, a Coast Guard who had been on patrol that morning, said George's body was solid as a rock. He had turned stiff and hard as if preserved in a plaster casing, yet he was the only one like that. No one has ever been able to find out why George's body naturally petrified. High Brazil. High Brazil is a mythical island that may secretly exist off the coast of Ireland. In Celtic folklore, the island is said to be completely covered in mist, except for on a single day once every 7 years. That's the only time it becomes visible, and yet it still cannot be physically reached. Those who live on the island are supposedly descendants of the old Irish clans of Brea Sail, who occupied Ireland thousands of years ago and then fled to their own secret island. Despite the name High Brazil, the cloaked island has no connection at all to the country of Brazil. But this is where things get really strange. The island is obviously mythical, and yet there also seems to be proof of it in the real world. In 1325, Angelino Dulcert created a map with a small island labeled Brasile to the west of Ireland. And in 1436, Andrea Bianco made a similar map showing yet another island called Insula de Brasil in the same spot. It happened again in 1480. But despite every attempt at finding the island, it has remained elusive. Maps all the way up until 1865 showed a mysterious island off the coast of Ireland. But as far as history books are concerned, no one has ever stepped foot on it. The shocking discovery of Easter Island. Even if you're familiar with Easter Island, you might not know how truly shocking its discovery was approximately 300 years ago. In 1722, curious explorers came across an unidentified rock in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific Ocean. They docked their ships and began to explore the island. It must have been like they were transported to an alien world. The explorers found over 800 gigantic statues, every single one almost identical, and not a single living soul. It was an island covered in eroded, megalithic faces left behind by a long-since extinct civilization. The mystery of Easter Island baffled the experts for centuries. It's 1,000 miles from any other piece of land, 1,400 miles from mainland South America. That makes it one of the most remote places in the world. And yet, between 600 and 800 AD, a group of Polynesians settled the island after sailing from an unknown starting point. These people called the island Rapa Nui. It was named Easter Island because Jacob Roggeveen found the deserted island on Easter Sunday, 300 years later, and the mystery still hasn't been solved. We know the gigantic statues were likely made to represent ancestral chiefs, who were thought to be descendants of gods. But what happened to the people of Rapa Nui, whether they suffered famine, used up all their resources, or simply left, is still unknown. Berlenga Islands. The Berlenga Islands off the coast of Portugal have been visited and occasionally inhabited by humans since the days of the Romans. Monks have lived here, pirates seeking sanctuary from the French and British navies, even Vikings stopped by on the islands for a bit of respite from all of their pillaging. Monks settled on the islands and built the monastery of the Misericordia da Berlenga. They stayed there until the 16th century when an outbreak of disease spread across the island. The disease killed almost everyone who didn't flee. The most famous installation is the Fort of São João Baptista das Berlengas. The fortress is located on the largest island of the Berlengas archipelago, once used to defend the coastline of Portugal. Construction of the fortress was ordered by King Manuel in 1502. So remember the monastery I just told you about? The one where the monks were infected with disease and forced to abandon it? Well, the fortress was built over the remains of the abandoned monastery. Even though the fortress was supposed to begin construction in 1502, nothing happened until 1651. Construction began in earnest in 1666, and the fortress was used later that same year to stop an attack by the Spanish fleet. A group of ships had been sent to kidnap Queen Maria Francisca of Savoy, but the newly constructed fortress stopped the invaders. It was completed in 1678, later occupied by British troops, and remodeled in 1821. The fort was used briefly during the Liberal Wars by supporters of Pedro IV of Portugal. Then it lost its usefulness and was abandoned. Then, in 1953, entrepreneurs tried to turn it into a hotel. This place was really popular.
The hunt for Atlantis. The legend of Atlantis began 2,000 years ago with the Greek philosopher Plato. Plato wrote about the human condition. He talked about morals, and he made up stories to capture our imaginations. One of his most famous stories was that of the ancient civilization called Atlantis. Plato wrote the story around 360 BC. If you know the real story that Plato told, you might not be so quick to believe this city ever existed. In his version of events, the Atlanteans were demigods, half god and half human. They were so great that they established a utopian civilization and developed the greatest navy the world had ever seen. Their homeland was a group of islands separated by huge canals, rich with gold and precious metals. There were also mythical animals, rare examples of wildlife not found anywhere else. According to Plato, the city existed 9,000 years before he lived. That would mean Atlantis is about 11,000 years old, a time in our history when humans weren't doing much except hunting and doodling on cave walls. He also claimed the story of Atlantis had been passed down for centuries by poets and priests. However, Plato's story is the only record of its existence. At the end of the tale, Atlantis grew greedy, and the gods didn't like that. The gods were angry that mortal people turned to immoral pursuits and punished them by sending earthquakes to sink their great city. So the big question is, did Atlantis really exist? Some say yes, and some say no. There is a theory that Atlantis was an island west of the Strait of Gibraltar that sank into the Atlantic Ocean as a result of earthquakes. Other discoveries point to Spain, Malta, Morocco, Sardinia, Turkey, Troy, and even the North Pole. It could be anywhere, really. Too bad Plato didn't leave just a few more clues. The Sea Peoples. The Sea Peoples were a group of mysterious humans who suddenly appeared in the Mediterranean region around 1276 BC. They came from unknown lands and caused utter havoc across coastal Mediterranean towns and cities. For over 100 years, they concentrated their efforts on pillaging and raiding, utterly decimating the Mediterranean world. They focused pretty heavily on Egypt, with their aggression being one of the leading causes of the Bronze Age collapse that finally came to a climax in 1150 BC. One of the biggest mysteries about the Sea Peoples is that nobody knows for sure where they came from. Most records of their invasions are from Egyptian sources. We know they came from the sea. They had huge warships, and no one could stand against them. It was only thanks to the extremely clever pharaoh Ramses II and his son Meremta that the Sea Peoples were destroyed. The mighty Egyptians defeated them fair and square in combat, vanquishing them forever back to the seas. One of the theories for the identity of the Sea People says they were Atlanteans, or at least the descendants of Atlanteans. Some experts have wondered if the Sea Peoples weren't the last bloodline of Atlantis, trying once more to dominate the world with their mighty navy. Do you believe in Atlantis? What about the Sea People? Tell me in the comments. Bulgaria's sunken city. There are a lot of sunken cities that aren't Atlantis. Take the 6,000-year-old city hiding beneath the sea in Bulgaria. Near the mouth of the Ropotamo River is a submerged settlement dating back to about 6,000 years after Atlantis was supposedly destroyed. It's sitting around 12 feet underneath the surface of the Black Sea. Researchers aren't even sure who built it. The settlement came from the early Bronze Age, containing marketplaces, harbors, and residential areas. It appears to have been a pretty major hub of activity, and possibly one of the first Greek colonies in the Black Sea. Archaeologists also identified buildings that were constructed in the Byzantine era, and much later in the Middle Ages and the Ottoman period. But things get more exciting still. In the general area, expeditions have revealed nearly 40 sunken ships at various depths. Archaeologists believe there was a construction boom in the area, with underwater ports being built across Bulgaria's coastline. But many of them, just like this one, sank for unknown reasons. It could have been an earthquake. It could have even just been natural sea level rising. In any case, it's a miracle that anything survived at all. The Pharaohs' Flooded Pyramid. In the ancient land of Nubia, what is currently located in Sudan, south of Egypt, there are ruins of a lost civilization. The rulers of the Kingdom of Kush had hundreds of pyramids built across their desert realm. Many of them are still standing today. At the ancient site of Nuri, there are still 20 ancient pyramids scattered across 170 acres of dry dirt and dust. There also happens to be a royal tomb here that is submerged by groundwater. The tomb is 2,300 years old, and its entrance is blocked by water stored beneath the earth. Above the tomb's entrance is a collapsed pyramid with its bricks slowly eroding. This is the tomb of Pharaoh Nastasin, one of the only flooded pyramid tombs in the world. The only way to explore the depths of the burial is by using diving equipment. In 2019, Archaeologist Pierce Paul Kreisman put on his diving mask, waded into the muddy water, and went to explore the tomb. He went to the first chamber, through the second, then into the third room, where in a completely flooded chamber was a royal sarcophagus. The coffin was still sealed with its heavy stone lid. The flooded tomb of the pharaoh is a perfect example of how history can be swallowed by the earth. The tomb certainly wasn't flooded when it was built around 300 BC. Yet as time went on, groundwater seeped through the bottom and filled it with water. If it wasn't for the crumbling remains of the pyramid above, it's very likely nobody would have ever found the pharaoh's watery resting place. It's shout-out time! I want to say a big thank you to Reed Tucker and Helen Hardman for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more videos like these. The drowned land of Stinga. There is an old Dutch legend about a sunken city that vanished in 1584. It's known as the drowned land of Stinga. Legend has it the city grew to be the most prosperous in all of the Netherlands. The inhabitants grew extremely proud. Farmers were prancing around in silk, horses were bedazzled in silver, and the thresholds of homes were carved from pure gold. The wealth these people achieved was utterly incredible. Thanks to all their money, poor immigrants began showing up in the town hoping to get in on the action. But the residents weren't interested in accepting outsiders. They would chase them away with sticks and let their dogs loose on them. It wasn't long before greed had corrupted the hearts of all the men and women in the city. Then came a foggy day in which a fisherman caught a mermaid. The mermaid told the fisherman that if he and his people didn't change their ways, they would suffer serious consequences. Then the mermaid's husband showed up and asked the fisherman to set his wife free, but the fisherman refused. This was where everything went downhill for the people of Stinga. They had become too greedy and too rude, not unlike the Atlanteans. Suddenly, their drinking water started tasting a little salty. Fish were swimming in their wells. It looked like the sea was pushing towards their coastal town. Then one day, a huge tidal wave came that washed all their buildings away, sweeping their riches into the ocean. No one has ever found the ruins of the city, but its legend is very similar to that of Atlantis. This town could very much be real, hidden somewhere off the coast of the Netherlands. Willow Grove. Dale Hollow Lake is famous for its crystal clear water. The lake sits near the border of Kentucky and Tennessee, but by no means is it natural. The reservoir was completed in 1943 by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The creation of the reservoir required an entire town to be abandoned and then flooded. Makes more sense than the opposite. The town was called Willow Grove, and it was purchased by the government in 1942. As you can imagine, the residents were not too happy to leave their homes. Willow Grove was a bustling community. The people who lived there were forced to abandon their houses, to give up their successful businesses, and to move away from everything they'd known just so the government could make a fake lake. But since this was in the middle of World War II, there wasn't much anyone could do to argue about it. The war helped the project be completed quickly, and over the last 80 years, Willow Grove has gradually been forgotten. What's left of the town can still be found submerged in Dale Hollow Lake. And so long as the lake never runs out of water, the town will remain preserved. In 1,000 years, people might even come across it again and have no idea what happened to those who live there. Atlit Yam. Atlit Yam is an ancient and completely submerged Neolithic settlement in Israel. The city was founded around 6900 BC, 2,000 years before Atlantis was supposedly destroyed. The inhabitants of Atlit Yam were primarily farmers. They used the fertile land to grow wheat and to feed their domesticated animals. But even farmers have to believe in something. The villagers were obsessed with their mystery religion. They built huge ritualistic installations around their cultivated fields. They had giant stone walls to keep out invaders and wild animals. These people were extremely advanced considering they lived 8,900 years ago. They'd even learned how to dig wells 30 feet through clay and sandstone to gain access to fresh water. But considering the entire city is currently underwater, you can guess what happened. The sea level began to rise, and the crater Adlityam was built in was flooded. By around 6,300 BC, only 600 years after being settled, the whole city was destroyed in a flood and abandoned. Atlantis and ancient Egypt. What if it was really the ancient Atlanteans who built the Great Pyramids of Giza? Not only the Great Pyramids in Egypt, but the pyramids from other parts of the world too, like in South America. Nobody has ever been able to wrap their minds around how so many different cultures were inspired to build pyramids in just about every corner of our planet. But there are some who believe they all have one commonality: the descendants of Atlantis. For this to make sense, we have to believe for a moment that everything Plato wrote about Atlantis was true. Atlantis was an advanced civilization 11,500 years ago, and they were destroyed by a devastating natural disaster. If we can agree on that, the theory about the pyramid starts to make a lot more sense. The Atlanteans, following their homeland's destruction, may have taken what few ships they had and spread across the globe. Some Atlanteans resettled in Egypt, others traveled the oceans and arrived in the Americas. They then shared their architectural ideas with the people whom they found living in these places. The theory is that the Atlanteans used their advanced knowledge of architecture and technology to push more primitive cultures into building great monuments like the pyramids. What do you think of this theory? Let me know in the comments. The city of Troy. There is yet another shocking theory about Atlantis we need to talk about. Some experts in the field of history believe the city of Troy may have been the city of Atlantis. This is because the city of Troy, first mentioned by Homer in his epic The Iliad, had a lot of similarities to the city described by Plato. It was located near the Pillars of Hercules. It had Poseidon as its patron god. The city boasted a complex system of water, and it was rich in natural resources. It was also destroyed by a great calamity. There isn't any physical evidence to suggest Troy, the ruins of which can be found in modern-day Turkey, was Atlantis, but they do share an astounding number of similarities. However, the biggest difference is time. Troy did not exist 11,000 years ago, but there may have been a mistake on Plato's part. We know he wrote about the city of Atlantis around 360 BC. But what if instead of 9,000 years earlier, he really meant 9,000 months earlier? That would place Atlantis as being a mighty nation in the 12th century BC. That was right around the time Homer claimed Troy was being destroyed by the Greeks with help from their mighty gods. If true, it would mean Atlantis' ruins are somewhere on the Turkish coast. Spanish Atlantis. A team of researchers from the United States, headed by Richard Freund, believe they have finally found the real location of the lost city of Atlantis. The team claims Atlantis was really located in southern Spain. They analyzed satellite images of what they suspected to be a sunken city north of Cadiz, and it was there, hidden in the marshy swamps of the Doña Ana Park, that they came across what appeared to be the ruins of an ancient city. The team used all the technology at their disposal to make the find. They used digital mapping, ground radar, and underwater tech to survey the potential site. What they found were a series of memorial cities which Richard says were built by refugees from Atlantis. After their great city was decimated by a tsunami 11,000 years ago, those who survived fled to Spain and built a new Atlantis. The evidence seems to suggest there were ancient cities built on the marshlands, not far from Plato's original description. In Plato's story, he wrote that Atlantis was located near the Pillars of Hercules, which historians now recognize as the Strait of Gibraltar. This matches up with the Spanish marshlands. But how do we know the cities here were built by Atlanteans and not some other civilization? The answer is that we don't. Richard and his team are speculating. There is no irrefutable evidence that points directly to the cities being constructed by people from Atlantis. The cities are real, but they could have been built by any group in the area over the past 10,000 years.
Today we have a special video with some very incredible guests. I have ocean explorers and real-life adventurers, Ashlyn and Philippe Cousteau. They went on an expedition to Antarctica and have graciously shared their top 10 most amazing things about Antarctica. And they have also answered questions asked by you, so be sure to give them a warm welcome.
Well, hello everyone. We are Ashlyn and Philippe Cousteau. We are explorers and ocean advocates.
And we just got back from a trip to Antarctica, and so we are here to share with you our top 10 coolest things, pun intended, about Antarctica. So, starting, Antarctica is home to krill, the tiniest of superheroes. This tiny little shrimp-like creature, measuring somewhere between 1 and 6 centimeters long, has a hugely important role to play in Antarctica. Antarctic krill make up the largest krill population globally, estimated at 400 million metric tons. That's a lot of krill. It's at the center of the food web. In fact, every single species in the Southern Ocean either eats krill or eats something else that eats krill. Krill provide 96% of calories for seabirds and mammals in the Antarctic Peninsula. And without krill, most marine life in Antarctica would not be able to survive. There are hundreds of trillions of them, and when they swarm, they are so big, they can be seen from space.
So krill are not only important as a food source, they are also climate superheroes as well, absorbing and storing CO2. Antarctic krill feed mainly on plankton, which are tiny floating plants that soak up carbon from the surface water as part of photosynthesis, creating energy to survive. Now they as in the krill, feed off this plankton and dive deep down, injecting carbon to the ocean floor when they poop. Now this has been estimated to be the same amount of carbon that 35 million cars emit each year. That's a lot of poop. Now whales that also feed off krill have poop that is rich in iron, and that in turn helps feed the phytoplankton, and that in turn feeds the krill, resulting in an amazing circle of life. But these little krill fellows have a rough ride. They're being sucked out of the ocean by large factory fishing vessels and ending up in food supplements or in fish food. Antarctic krill are so much more valuable in the ocean than out. And that's just one of the reasons that we need to take no-take marine protected areas that stops krill fishing in important areas for wildlife, such as areas that penguins use to feed their chicks, but more on that later.
Antarctica is home to 18 different species of penguins, but only 2 of them live exclusively on the continent of Antarctica. The emperor penguin, made famous by, of course, Happy Feet, and its cute, smaller counterpart, the Adelie. And we did see Adelie penguins when we were down in Antarctica. But
we did, and I've been to Antarctica twice, and I miss emperors both times. Very sad.
But their home and, of course, survival are at risk from, you guessed it, climate change and fishing. Antarctic penguin populations have been declining dramatically, some even as much as 75% over the past 50 years. And it's vital that we protect their home and the food that they rely on. And contrary to some popular belief, and maybe some cartoons that we grew up with, there are no polar bears in Antarctica and no penguins in the Arctic. So no, penguins and polar bears never meet.
As you all know, it is very cold in Antarctica, and some animals actually have antifreeze in their blood. Now, as you can imagine, some of the animals that live in Antarctica, or actually all of the animals that live in Antarctica, are super badass because you need to be when you have made the windiest, coldest, driest, and most hostile environments in the world your home.
Yep.
But the continent is actually teeming with life, and animals have found amazing ways to adapt, including some species of fish that have natural antifreeze in their blood that actually keeps them from freezing. Now these freaky looking fish are called ice fish, and they don't have any red blood cells. Instead, it has a special protein or special proteins in their blood that act like antifreeze. The proteins bind to ice crystals, keeping them small and prevent the fish from turning into fish popsicles.
Which, you know, if you're an ice fish, that's a good thing. Now, that means big. Some invertebrates in the poles, like marine spiders, can be as big as dinner plates. Kind of freaky. Even some single-celled organisms that are normally only visible under a microscope can be as big as a pinky nail. Now, no one's sure why this happens, but one theory is that there's naturally a lot of oxygen in cold water. And these animals that live in cold water, well, they don't move very quickly, so they don't need a lot of oxygen. So what do? They use that oxygen to grow bigger. But that's just a theory. So, as you can see, there's still a lot to discover in Antarctica.
We're both big people. Maybe there was too much oxygen.
That might be why we're so tall. Yeah.
We are learning new things about Antarctica every single day. Now, we still know so little about the continent, and scientific discoveries are being found seriously like almost every hour.
Yeah.
For example, just a few months ago, scientists found the world's largest known colony of breeding fish off the coast of Antarctica below ice that covers part of the Weddell Sea. And it's like I love them. It's ice fish, baby. Yes, the ones we talked about earlier with antifreeze. It was approximately about 60 million nests were found in an area of about 93 square miles in size. It's a lot of nests.
60 million nests. That's a lot of nests. Antarctic ice is pretty cool. Now, 90% of the world's surface fresh water is held in Antarctic ice sheets. Now, Antarctic ice also plays a critical role in regulating the Earth's climate because its white surface acts as an enormous reflector, sending solar radiation and heat back into space and keeping the planet cool. In winter, seasonal sea ice doubles the area of Antarctica. Now, the growth of sea ice generates dense, heavy, salty water that helps drive deep global ocean currents, which regulate the entire Earth's climate, which means weather. The weather that you rely on and we all rely on every day to water our crops and to be a sunny day at the beach, whatever it is, Antarctica. Now, Antarctica has two different types of ice. There's land ice, the Antarctic ice sheet, which is the largest mass of ice on the planet at almost twice the size of Australia. And if you actually spread the Antarctic ice sheet across the United States and Mexico, they would be covered in a layer of ice around 7,000 feet thick. That's 2,000 meters. That's a lot of ice. Now, there's also sea ice. So each winter, when it gets really cold, the Antarctic coastline is transformed as the ocean freezes over, surrounding the continent with a fringe of ice as large as the continent itself. At its winter maximum, Antarctic sea ice covers an area of around 11 million square miles. That's 18 million square kilometers, almost twice the size of the US and larger than Antarctica itself. Unfortunately, increasing temperatures mean that ice is melting, with glaciers losing ice at unprecedented rates, impacting global sea level rise and Antarctic ecosystems. In 2021, an important science report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change predicted sea level will rise between 11 and 21 inches, or 28 and 55 centimeters, by the end of the century. However, they note that a sea level rise of 6 feet or more can't be ruled out as a worst case scenario. Yikes.
No one, well, technically no humans, permanently live in Antarctica, but there are residents that are down there. So there's over 30 different countries that operate around 80 research stations on the continent. Most people are there during the summer months, around 4,000 people, and that drops down to about 1,000 during the long, cold, harsh winters. And many of the people are scientists and researchers that study all sorts of different things, from weather, wildlife, icebergs, and glaciers.
Antarctica belongs to all of us, including you. Now, Antarctica is part of the global commons, which means that it belongs to no single individual country or state, but to all of us. Via the Antarctic Treaty System that was agreed in 1959, the entire continent is dedicated to peace and science. And on the continent, all extractive activities, like mining, have been banned. Unfortunately, the waters around Antarctica are still open to extraction, and countries are fishing there for krill and things like Antarctic toothfish, which has been rebranded as Antarctic cod, even though...
Because nobody wants to eat a
Nobody
toothfish.
wants to eat a toothfish, except it's not a cod. That's just some shifty rebranding. And of course, all of that overfishing is competing with wildlife that also need to feed.
Interesting fact about Antarctica: the protection of its waters are still limited, despite being one of the most amazing and fragile places on Earth. Now, Antarctica and its waters are seen as being very important to the health of our planet and to our climate. Yet protection of these waters has been very limited. There's only 2 areas that have been protected because action continues to be stalled by governments that are members of this little known but very important organization, the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, or CAMLAR for short. Now, why should we care? Because what happens in Antarctica does not stay in Antarctica. And while it may seem so far away, the impacts that it is experiencing will not be localized. They will affect the whole planet, from changes in our climate to sea level rise, and changes in how the ocean functions as a whole will have knock-on effects. So if you learned everything from us today, it is that Antarctica is cool, it's exciting, and it needs our protection.
Yeah, and if you want to help, then you can join us and sign a simple petition for the protection of Antarctica's waters at only.1/act/Antarctica. And all of us can build a hopeful, better world for the future.
And now for some questions you asked. But first, be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. For many people, Jacques Cousteau was their childhood hero. So what made you want to carry on the family legacy?
My grandfather, Jacques Cousteau, and my father, Philippe Sr., were pioneers of ocean exploration and filmmaking. Of course, I grew up with those films. And though I never knew my father, he died 6 months before I was born in an airplane accident, I still had his books and movies and all the things that he'd done. And, those adventures were amazing. My grandfather, told me growing up all the stories and all the amazing places that he went. And it was like real life Indiana Jones. And frankly, I was like, yeah, I want to do this. Like, this is the coolest thing ever. So it wasn't a hard decision when I got an opportunity to continue in the spirit of that work.
What was your first expedition?
What was my first expedition? My first expedition was to Papua New Guinea. I was 16 years old and got to do some pretty amazing research there with Dr. Eugenie Clark, one of my heroes, one of the pioneering female oceanographers. Diving with sharks and exploring like skull caves up in mountains of abandoned, like lost civilizations. I mean, it really was like Indiana Jones. But yeah.
My very first expedition, like proper expedition, is when we went to Bikini Atoll to film how shark populations had surprisingly come back after the United States had detonated some of the largest nuclear bombs, well, the largest nuclear bombs we've ever detonated to date. And that was really incredible. That was for nuclear sharks that we did for Shark Week. And that was just incredible. So just incredible experience and something I'll always remember.
Now, what are some of the exciting projects we're working on? Well, 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago now, I founded Earth Echo International. We've become one of the leading global youth education organizations, and we're building a global youth movement to restore and protect our ocean. And that's always exciting, working with youth leaders, passionate young people in over 140 countries that are taking action to help restore and protect our oceans. We're working on TV shows and animated series.
And one thing right here, by the way, whoop whoop, if you want to learn more about the ocean in general and how cool the ocean is, we wrote the book Oceans for Dummies, which is really just that
was one of our COVID projects.
It's a fun, easygoing, but deep dive into our oceans and how they work.
What are some of the most shocking changes you've seen in the ocean over the years?
A lot. And I think it's interesting because I have in Ashland as well now, as we have this generational.
Okay, it's usually 3, but I guess that was only 2. Sorry.
Personally, growing up with my grandfather's films like Silent World from the 1950s, like I grew up in the south of France as well, and in part back and forth from the U.S. to France, and snorkeling in those places, and you look at the footage from the 1950s and 1960s, and then you go back to those same places today, and where there were once schools of sharks and giant grouper and reefs and all sorts of amazing things, there's now just algae and a few little fish poking around. So, we have chronicled the modern era of ocean exploration, my family, but we've also, as part of that, witnessed the decline of the health of the ocean around the world, and it's pretty horrific.
And I think too, just the shocking amount of large changes that are happening in our ocean. Everything from the acidity level. Ocean acidification is a huge issue. The ocean's actually getting more acidic, and any creature that actually has to bind calcium carbonate for their shell is making it harder for them to do that. That's everybody from krill to oysters to mollusks to
coral reefs.
Yeah. The water is warming and the sea level is rising. So there's some really, really big issues out there But the good news is we know what works, and we know that marine protected areas work, and marine protected areas will actually can save these areas and make the ocean healthier and give it a better fighting chance in the face of these huge issues.
Why is Antarctica so important?
I mean, I think we covered that in the top 10.
Yes, but still, Antarctica is important because it is the air conditioning of our planet. It controls our climate, including our weather and the rain that falls. Even if you live in the middle of a country with no ocean, you still,
Your life is impacted. Yeah,
thanks to
by Antarctica.
Antarctica.
It drives food for the global ocean food web, of course, which feeds hundreds of millions of people and is so important to the entire system as it works.
Helps give us oxygen, available oxygen in our atmosphere to breathe. And
the largest carbon sink on Earth, Antarctica, and the Southern Ocean surrounding it, and of course provides food to the entire ocean food web. So kind of important.
Kind of a big deal.
Yeah, and when we were down there, we got to witness just a little bit of that, but it's in a majestic, wild, far off, amazing place that even if you're landlocked and you're never near the ocean, affects your life.
What's the scariest expedition you've been on?
They haven't been scary.
I mean, nuclear sharks. There was a couple points where we had like 60 or 70 sharks swirling around us and bumping into us and like coming to check us out. That was a little hairy. Some of the dives of Caribbean Pirate Treasure with the currents and the zero visibility. And
That's true.
I think I toughened her up. She's doing some stuff now that she doesn't even realize that like, oh wow, that was actually really scary. We almost died. So listen, there's all sorts of wild things out there. I would say though that frankly, I've never really felt like, our lives were really in danger because we plan well. The only times I've ever been on an expedition where I felt like my life was in danger was actually being threatened by people, which is much longer stories. But yes,
yeah, that's
never
true.
We've
been with sharks, and we've been with lots of sharks and big animals, and we've never felt afraid.
Yeah.
Except from humans.
Yeah, exactly.
What's your favorite spot to explore that you would never get tired of? Any recommendations?
Acapulco, Mexico. Yeah. It is a beautiful, protected marine no-take marine reserve, and it is absolutely gorgeous. And the wildlife there is incredible. The people are lovely, and all you want to do is put a tank on your back, flop in the water, and just look around for days on end.
I would say mine is both Cabo Pulmo is one of my favorites. It's up there, but my favorite is Shabarumi Reef off of the Red Sea, where my grandfather built the Con Shelf 2 expedition in the 1960s. That place was and is still amazing. The ruins of that underwater living habitat still exist, and the reef is amazing. And there's schooling hammerheads. I visited for a show for BBC years ago, and it's definitely a place I would never get tired of going back to.
How do you inspire and educate people?
Through the media, and
I think
Ashlyn wrote most of Oceans for Dummies.
Yeah, I think through everything that we do, and including Earth Echo, our books, our television series, our documentaries, we just always try to make the ocean accessible and exciting, and really just hope that you all fall in love with the ocean and realize how important it is to us every single day, and places like Antarctica.
What would you say to people who don't believe in global warming or climate change?
We've been at this a long time. We've kind of given up trying to convince people. If they are willfully ignorant and want to completely ignore all the same science that gives them modern medicine and engineering of cars and all these things that we like take for granted and accept, but they decide that they don't want to believe the science behind climate change, really hard to convince them. The good news is I have never walked into a classroom or a group of young people anywhere in the world that are like, no, climate change doesn't exist. So the good news is that there's a generation of young people out there that don't question that. All they want to do is do something about it and solve that problem. So we don't waste our time. If you want to be ignorant, then I'm not going to convince you otherwise in 30 seconds or 20 minutes or an hour. That's your choice, unfortunately, but we just move on and work with the vast majority of people that don't question things like, science.
Science!
What can people do from home? How can people participate?
Honestly, everything you do makes a difference, be it a positive or a negative difference for our planet and for our ocean and for Antarctica. So really everything that you do, look at plastic. How can you buy less plastic? How can you use less plastic? How can you reduce your carbon footprint, be it by taking a bike or walking instead of driving your car? We only have one car between the two of us, and we've made that work even with 2 kids and even during COVID. You know, really anything. Try to cut out harsh chemicals, harsh cleaning chemicals around your house. Water and vinegar does amazing things.
Yep.
And saves you money. And really just try to, next time you think you need something, ask yourself, do you really need it?
Yeah.
Or could you find something else to use instead?
So there you have it. Thanks so much to this amazing couple. Again, if you want to learn more, check out earthecho.org, as well as Awesome Planet on Fox and Hulu. Together, Ashlyn and Philippe have done numerous TV specials and shows, so be sure to check them out if you want to learn more. Remember to subscribe before you leave, and let me know if you'd like to see more videos like these. See you next time. Bye!